My name's Jeremy Grant. I'm an English teacher at WQE, and this is the A-level English Language and Literature taster lesson. So what we're going to do this lesson, first of all, we're going to do a kind of a short lesson on a poem, because it's called a taster lesson, so that's what we do. If we have any time at the end, though, we'll have a Q&A session. If we don't have time at the end, you can still send questions into WQE and we'll get them answered for you. Okay, so probably on your screen you should be able to see a hands up button, which you might come in useful during this lesson, and also the Q&A button. So I'm going to get you to enter little things into the Q&A during the course of the lesson. Okay, so first things first, this lesson we're going to do a poem by William Blake. So the first thing I want you to do, could you just put hands up, please, if you've studied William Blake in school? Does anyone know anything about William Blake? Okay, so I'll give you a bit of information about William Blake. So William Blake was a Romantic poet. So he was contemporaries with William Wordsworth. He was a real radical poet. He had lots of interesting ideas about the world, and he wrote during a time which in literature we called Romanticism. So Romanticism also featured the poet William Wordsworth, and William Wordsworth was also a Romantic poet. So what were they famous for? They were famous for writing about nature. So you might have done the prelude in school in literature. They were interested they wrote in the wake of the French Revolution, so they're quite political poets. And they were interested in the self. You know, they sort of examined what human beings were really like, in particular emotions. And so this will lead us on to this particular poem that we're going to do, which is sort of all about the idea of love. So just before we start, I want you to use your Q&A chat, and I want you to think about the following question, and I want you to type your answer into the Q&A. Okay, so the question is love selfish or selfless? So what do I mean by that? Like, when we're in love with someone, what do we, do we treat that relationship with someone else as a relationship where we get what we want from that other person? That's one view of love. Or is that relationship with someone else, do we think love is all about giving something to someone else? So that could be like a love relationship as a romantic relationship. But there's other types of love relationships that you have in your lives, like, for example, familial relationships, like relationships with parents and children. Okay, so what I want you to do, just put in the meeting chat, do you think love is selfless or selfish? So we've already got a few answers in, so it's a Q&A bit on your screens. So some people are thinking love is selfish, selfless. Archie, can you just explain what you mean by that? We've got a bit of a mix. Some people are saying it's selfless, and some people are saying it's selfish. Some of you are hanging on the fence a bit. Okay, selfish. Okay, so this question is really what the poem that we're going to look at is really what it's all about. Okay, so I'm just going to show you, like, William Blake. I'm just going to move on to the next slide. William Blake was also an artist, so he's kind of unusual as a poet in that he would write poems, but he saw himself as an artist as well. And it is probably his most famous book, which I think you might have done London in a GCSE literature. Have any of you done London? If so, pop it in the meeting chat. I'm just trying to keep up with it a bit. He basically writes these poems and then he illustrates his own poems. So that kind of illustration you can see on the screen there is William Blake's illustration. So I can see Nicole did London. I'm pretty certain, probably, if you haven't done it already, you'll probably do it quite soon. So this is the illustration for the Clod and the Pebble, which is basically, he wrote songs of innocence and experience. Songs of Innocence was obviously all about the idea of innocence, and Songs of Experience was all about the idea of experience. And this poem was from Songs of Experience. Okay, now normally I'd read that out, but because that's quite difficult to read that slide, I'm just going to move on to the next slide on the next page so we can read it. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to read this poem out, and I'm going to set you a task just to think about it. Okay, so this poem's called The Clod and the Pebble, and it's a poem all about love. Just so you know from the start, a clod is simply a bit of mud like you get on, say, a pathway, or in this case at the bottom of a river. And in the poem, a bit of mud, it sounds quite surreal, a bit of mud and a pebble have a conversation about love. That's what this poem's about. Okay, here we go then. The Clod and the Pebble. Love seeketh not itself to please, nor for itself have any care, but for another gives its ease, and builds a heaven in hell's despair. So sung a little clod of clay, trodden with a cattle's feet, but a pebble of the brook warbled out those meters meet. Love seeketh only self to please, to bind another to its delight, joys in another's loss of ease, and builds a hell in heaven's despite. Okay, so I'm just going to read that out one more time. So you should always read poems twice because it's quite dense language. It takes you a while to kind of absorb what's going on in the poem. So read it out one more time. And this time, just think about the clod, what sort of person the clod is, what sort of person the pebble is, and what are their views on love. Okay. Love seeketh not itself to please, nor for itself hath any care, but for another gives its ease, and builds a heaven in hell's despair. So sung a little clod of clay, trodden with the cattle's feet, but a pebble of the brook warbled out these meters meet. Love seeketh only self to please, to bind another to its delight, joys in another's loss of ease, and builds a hell in heaven's despite. Okay, so what I'm going to get you to do then is a short activity. Okay, so I'll move on to the next slide just to explain this activity. And then I'm going to move back to the poem so you can see that on the screen. So normally, if this was a real kind of non-virtual class, face-to-face class, I'll split the class in two or put you into groups. Okay, so to do that, what we're going to do is we're focused on your first names. If your first name begins with letters A to M, I want you to focus on the clod. Okay, so if your first name begins with A to M, focus on the clod. And if your first name begins with N to Z, focus on the pebble. Okay, so in a bit we're going to go back to the poem on the screen. And there's two questions I want you to focus on. If you're focusing on the clod, you're looking at the first 6 lines. And if you're focusing on the pebble, you're focusing on the last 6 lines. 2 questions I want you to answer. What do you learn about the clod or the pebble? They're kind of personified, aren't they? Blake's imagined them as human beings. He's given them the qualities of human beings. So what sort of, if we're imagining them as human beings, what sort of human beings are they? Okay. And the second question is, what is their view of love? Okay. Okay, so we go back to that first slide. And what I want you to do, as you think of ideas in answer to those 2 questions, just pop them in the meeting chat. Don't wait until the end to press send. You know, think of an idea, pop it in the meeting chat. So we've got a bit of a rolling kind of feedback. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to give you, I'll give you 3 minutes, I think, to do this task. And I'm going to keep an eye on the meeting chat, the Q&A there, just to see how you're getting on. Okay, and I can already see some of you said that some of you did London in school, didn't you? But in terms of selfless or selfish, it's a bit of an interesting answer there, Jack. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying there, Fern. Can you answer the other question about what sort of character is the clod? What do you mean by inconvenience, Nicole Mary? I'd like to know that. It's an interesting point. Yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't like to go out with a pebble either, Rabia. I think there'd be a bit of a nightmare. There's some really good answers coming in here, guys. Keep it going. Yeah, that's interesting, Jack. What you just developed your earlier point there. Good, Sophia. So interesting points are about you done a bit of analysis of what sort of character is the pebble. I think I agree with you. Good, yeah, I like what you've said, Kira, about the clod being soft, and that's kind of representation of the character in some way. I think that's exactly what Blake intended there. If you finish, just have a read through of other people's comments. Pretty good comments coming in. Yeah, indeed. Thanks for that, Nicole. Yeah, I like your focus, Jazz, on the word builds there. That the clod seems someone who's willing to work on it, or, you know, work on a relationship. Certainly, the connotations of that word builds in that first 6 lines. That seems to be what's suggested. Yeah, I like that, Sophia. The pebble is a narcissist and a pessimist. Yeah, I don't know if the two are similar, linked in some way. That's an interesting question, isn't it? Okay, guys. So I'm gonna go back to some really good, interesting points there about the poem. Let's move on in the slides. And what I do, I'm gonna just talk because we'll just talk through the two halves of the poem, drawing on the brilliant comments you've made in the meeting chat as well. So the first let's look at the clod. So the clod is so one of you mentioned a clod because it's like clay, or mud effectively. It's kind of soft, and I think that was a really good point. I won't be able to remember your names as I go through this, but I think that's a really good point because there is something soft about the clod's kind of view of the world, and in particular their view of relationships. So an interesting question to think about in relation to this poem is that softness, is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? So you feel free to add points to the meeting chat as we go through this. Just bear in mind that I might not be able to pick them up as I work through this as well. But so one way we can think of the clod, that softness being a good thing. I suppose going into a relationship, if you're kind of quite a hard character, that can lead to problems in the relationship. If you're the kind of person who's kind of softer, maybe better at, for example, listening and accommodating that other person in your relationship, you could argue that will be more beneficial in terms of the long-term success of the relationship. On the other hand, the other way to look at that softness is that the clod of clay is trodden with the cattle's feet. So there's another way of looking at that. Probably the modern term for that might be, you know, you're a bit of a doormat in a relationship. You let people kind of walk all over you. And Blake's a kind of poet who doesn't, particularly in Songs of Innocence and Experience, he doesn't tend to come down on one side. He often sets up ideas and lets you decide for yourself. So he's much more interested, I would say, in your opinion, kind of as a reader. He sets up these two opposites and he thinks he's almost holding them up to say, well, what do you think? So most of you got this idea that the clod was selfless. So it says, love seeketh not itself to please. Those first two lines are like the speech of the clod of clay. And it doesn't have care for itself, which is exactly the same point. It's selfless. It going into that relationship with the other person. They focus on the other person instead of themselves. And for another gives its ease. So they're thinking of the benefit of that other person. Once I did this in class, and one of my students said, well, isn't the clod much closer to parental love? You know, like that idea that most parents, hopefully your parents as well, most parents, they put their children before themselves in, you know, and it is a kind of a much more selfless love. On the other hand, that doesn't discount the interpretation that it could be within a love relationship between a man and a woman, or a man and man, or woman and woman, or whatever, that you do get one partner who puts the other person first. I don't think Blake presents that as good or bad. It just presents it as a possibility. And then this really important line, which he comes to in the second half, and builds a heaven in hell's despair. Now, there's different interpretations of this. I'm just going to read what Jazz says. The clod's determination is further demonstrated in through the juxtaposition between the noun trodden and the verb builds. Yeah. So on one hand, it's a really good point that Jazz has made here. On one hand, the clod can be trodden on, but the clod is also a builder, someone who builds relationships. But the way I interpret that fourth line, and builds a heaven in hell's despair, I think there's lots of ways you can interpret it. This is just one, is that if the world is a hellish place, which you could argue it can be, I don't mean to be too bleak, a clod type character can make it seem heaven-like from their own action, their own kind of good actions. So they can build a heaven in a kind of a hellish world. And if you do London, which I'm pretty certain a lot of you will do in literature, you know, in that poem, Blake portrays London as a hellish place. So it is in his worldview that it can be seen as hellish. Okay, let's move on to the second half, which focuses on the pebble. So it's very neatly structured, the poem. So most of you, one of you, I can't remember who it was, apologize, but you mentioned that the pebble by contrast is hard and therefore a hard character. It's a little bit, that view of him is a little bit undermined perhaps by the fact he warbles out these lines. So that warble, to me, it doesn't seem like a very a strong voice. A warble, like certain birds warble, and I'm not going to warble because this lesson's being recorded, but it's kind of like the music of a warble goes up and down. It's like a tremor in your voice, and if you have a tremor in your voice, it doesn't suggest the kind of confidence that everything else about the pebble suggests. One of you suggested that the pebble was a kind of a narcissistic character. I think it's a good way of thinking about him. That word warble seems to undermine that view, but I would say mainly, I think I agree with a lot of what you said there. It's a hard character, and his view of love is quite a hard view. So it's also the opposite of the clod. So he says, love seeketh only self to please, to bind. So love is all about yourself. You you meet someone and you get what you want from that relationship is the pebbles view. To bind another to its delight. So I would say this line is that idea that if you think someone likes you, you get a kind of coming back to that word narcissism, you get a kind of narcissistic kick, don't you? Like you think, oh, that person likes me. You kind of get a bit big-headed about it. And you like, even if you're never gonna give back any love to that person, you kind of enjoy the fact that that person likes you. So it's quite in that way that love sort of love can be quite selfish. You bind that person to you, but you're not willing to give anything back to them. And I would say that also explains the third line there. It enjoys another's loss of ease. So in a relationship, that idea that they might like you and you're not giving anything back, you actually enjoy that feeling that that person's feeling a bit uneasy or anxious in that relationship. So the pebble is quite you know, I wouldn't say it's not a nice kind of character, but it's probably also true. I think there's elements of of these two characters in all of us, perhaps. And the last point about the pebble, it's the opposite of the clod again. He builds a hell in heaven's despite. So if you saw the world as heaven, the pebble would somehow be able to make a hell out of it. You know, they can make their partner feel as if they're in hell in some way. So that's a little run through of these two characters. We're going to go back to the Q&A again. So all I want you to do is just say, do you think you're more a clod or a pebble? Okay, so I want you to just put it in the meeting, in the Q&A there now. Just write clod or pebble. Do you think you're more a clod or a pebble? Clod, yeah. This is really similar to when I did this in class. I should just ask, are there any pebbles in the room? Is anyone going to admit to being a pebble? No one wants to, do they? But clod isn't brilliant. Both of them are kind of bad for different reasons. Fern, could you explain that bit? Maybe another comment? Yeah, I think we've got a class full of clods here. So Sophia's point is interesting. I'll come back to Sophia's point, in fact, because so when I did this in class, the whole class put their hand up, yeah, I'm a clod, I think including me. And then there was one student had their hand up who was a pebble, and they're really certain they were. But I kind of agree with Sophia. That was almost a trick question in a way, in that if you think about it, you're probably a mixture of both. I don't think so. Blake set these up as opposites. But the subtitle for the Songs of Innocence and Experience is that it's an exploration of the two contrary states of the human soul. So he doesn't think of people as either innocent or experienced. He thinks that everyone is both innocent and experienced. So within all of us, I think he would say, there is a clod and a pebble within all of us. We have the capacity, the potential to be both of them in kind of love relationships. However, so this is the final thing we're going to look at. So if we think about what's Blake's view, is Blake biased from one to another? Okay, and so I'm just going to move on to this final slide just to explain this book, because I think it's quite an interesting one. So the poem is divided into two halves, okay? The first 6 lines about the clod, the last 6 lines about the pebble, and that's reflected in the structure. So the poem is this really simple title, The Clod and the Pebble, linked together with the conjunction and then that title is reflected in the structure of the poem, 6 lines about clod, 6 lines about the pebble. And so what we get is this idea that Blake presents us equally the 2 points of views. Okay, so moving on to that second bullet point, this allows the reader to compare the two opposing views, or contraries as Blake called them, and come to their own conclusion. So Blake referred to these two opposite aspects of ourselves, innocence and experience in this case, and the very clear structure and equal structure in the poem. He's simply showing us these two views of the world, and he wants us to decide. Okay, so that is one view about what Blake thinks. There is, however, a kind of a counter argument to that, which is in the third bullet point on your screen. So, so he starts with the clod and ends with the pebble, and that could be a clue as to what his views are. So he says, by putting them in this order, the view of the pebble seems to undermine the view of the clod, a bit like a counter argument. So if you're going to write a counter argument in an essay, you start with your argument and then your counter argument comes second, and it begins to attack the first argument. So you could argue that the clod, so the pebble coming second, is almost like a counter argument. And it begins, it says on the screen there, with the conjunction but. So it's saying, however, what about this view? So he begins with this very positive view of love. Then he has, but have you thought of this more negative view of love? And you could say possibly that means that Blake thinks, you know, he's slightly biased towards the pebbles view. Okay, so what I'm trying to emphasize is that the structure of the poem on one hand shows that they're both equal, the 2 points of view are both equal. On the other hand, the pebble coming second possibly undermines what the clod says at the start. Okay, guys, so we've got I'm just looking in the meeting. We've got 3 minutes left, and then we have to go because I think there's a new session coming up. Has anyone got 2 minutes left? Has anyone got any questions in the last 2 minutes? Okay, if you haven't, I'm just reading some really nice point there, Jack, at the end. I don't know. You'd have, if you have any questions, you can email admissions, and you might be able to get a recording of the session afterwards. I don't know that myself though, Mohammed. I'll tell you what, I'll ask a couple of questions myself just in the last minute. One good question that often comes up is, what text do we do? So you do an anthology of non-fiction texts where you're doing the kind of linguistic analysis on those. You do a play called A Streetcar Named Desire by Tennessee Williams, which is quite a popular choice. You do Blake, which is why I've done a Blake poem today. You do a novel, American novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald called The Great Gatsby. And you do a non-fiction text by Bill Bryson, where you have to compare it. It's a piece of coursework, actually, where you have to compare it with a novel of your choice. So there's a bit of flexibility with that piece of coursework. You do kind of a little bit of grammar and stuff like that, but also like spoken language analysis. So you do a bit of analysis about the way we speak rather than just write. And I think that is everything. I don't think I'll miss that. And that's a really Potter summary. What I will say though, because we're going to have to go now, is that if you've got any follow-up questions, please email admissions, so admissions@wqe.ac.uk. Okay. Shame I couldn't see you in the flesh because of COVID, but it's been some really great contributions. And I hope to see you at WQE next year. Okay, bye guys. Really nice to have this online encounter with you. Bye.